Hey there, interwebs, I hope you're doing well. Today's video is going to be something a little bit different, mostly because I've spent the last 2 weeks or so laid out with a really bad sinus infection. You can probably hear it a little bit in my voice right now, like, it has been nothing but mucus up in this mouth all day. I could honestly, at one point I could barely breathe. It was honestly kind of scary, and it's been a rough couple of weeks. And while I'm definitely on the upswing, I'm still not feeling all that great at the moment. In fact, the only reason I'm able to even, like, it's kind of apparently talk on camera right now is because I'm hopped up on all sorts of painkillers. It's kind of fun. I'm not even confident that I'm actually fully awake right now, and I'm not entirely sure why I'm talking to a giraffe, but we do what we must. But as a result, I haven't really been able to put together the video that I've been planning on for this week because I've been focused on either alternatively sleeping on my couch or watching Ted Lasso while eating the only food I can currently stomach, which is yogurt. So instead, this week I've decided I'm going to share with you this video I made a few months ago for a psychology conference that I was supposed to present in person in fancy Europe. I don't know why I had a mustache for that. Like, I'm European, people have mustaches, ho ho ho. But because of COVID, obviously I just had to do it as a video. Like a plebeian. But this video is for a larger presentation about trans and feminine depictions in media for a psychological perspective. And I was asked to join this research group to provide my expertise, such as it is, as a media critic and analyzer. And so I think it's a fun little video primer for you. It's meant more of a starter pack for folks who don't know a lot about film theory rather than like a deep analysis. But I try to make it a good starting place for anyone who wants to understand a basic framework of how trans folks have been seen in film up until this point. And so with that in mind, I hope that you enjoy it. Now, with all that said, I'm going to rest my voice, and I'm going to go curl up in bed with Jason Sudeikis and this giraffe. So it's going to be a fun night. Hi, I'm Jessie, Earl, an LGBTQ media critic, reporter, YouTuber, and co-author of Critical Consumption of Transgender and Non-Binary Representations in Popular Culture and Social Media. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And I am presenting A Cisgender Gaze, How the Grammar of Film Views Transgender People. In recent years, as transgender awareness has increased and changed in the late 90s and only grown into the 21st century, so too has how transgender narratives have been portrayed in cinema. Despite having spent most of Hollywood's history as the butt of the joke or something to be scorned or hidden, trans people have suddenly become the objects of fascination to be ogled, uplifted, and even pitied. This presentation is going to be me attempting to provide the beginnings of an academic and theoretical framework and lens through which to understand trans representation in cinema, and how these representations fit within the larger discourse of cinema studies as a whole. So, what is a cisgender gaze? In order to have this conversation, I'm going to incredibly water down a concept that has been evolving in cinema studies for half a century. Because in order to talk about what I mean by the cisgender gaze, we need to talk about the concept of the male gaze. The male gaze was a film theory coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. Contrary to popular belief, the male gaze isn't simply a camera looking at a woman in a movie, but how aspects of cinema work together to frame an entire group of people in one way or another, in most cases women. For Mulvey, she looked at how cinema often portrayed a certain type of man, typically white, straight, cisgender, more aggressive, and emotionally closed off, as normal and the central viewpoint through which we view a narrative in a film. This default viewpoint was often due to the fact that many of the creators behind the camera, from writers, directors, producers, and many others, were often the same type of straight white men that we were discussing here, and therefore their way of seeing the world became the assumed viewpoint of not only the film itself, but of also the audience watching the film. Films are made with this conversation in mind between creator and viewer, and so the assumption that the audience itself was mostly straight white men informed what these movies were about. Films are what we call voyeuristic, something where we get pleasure from looking at things. And typically, we like to look at things that are different from ourselves, to see something fantastical, something different than our own everyday life. That's why many of us go to the cinema, at least when it comes to bigger budget Hollywood movies, to see things we wouldn't see in our normal lives. So, if much of cinema assumes that straight white men are the default watchers and creators of the film, then this means that anything that wasn't a straight cisgender white man was treated as other by both the people making the film itself, and by the audiences watching the film, or at least the assumed audience. And so we get the male gaze, where a film treats a woman as something different, fantastical, and otherworldly, something to be looked at and ogled, because they are something different than the assumed straight white male creators and audience of the film. This led women to be categorized and objectified by the camera, with conventionally beautiful women being ogled by the camera watching them, and thus being seen as a spectacle. Think of how director Michael Bay framed Megan Fox in the movie Transformers, with the camera showing things from the male character's point of view, staring at her arched back and prominent breasts. We even get a reaction shot within the film of Shia LaBeouf reacting to Fox's beauty, seemingly to echo the audience's own presumed reaction and how hot we're supposed to find her, to show how we're supposed to feel about her beauty. Shia LaBeouf's reaction is a reflection of what we're supposed to feel looking at her as the audience. How does all of this apply to transgender people? Well, in the same way that straight white men are assumed to be the viewpoint of a film, so too does a film portray cisgender people as the assumed viewpoint of a film, and treats trans people as the other. Up to the close of the turn of the century, most transgender representations on screen were mostly not explicitly transgender at all, but often moments where boundaries of gender or gender norms were crossed, often done for comedy. There's a long-standing trend in comedy movies where one gender pretends to be another for comedy's sake. This goes all the way back to the earliest silent films with movies like A Florida Enchantment, where a woman eats a seed and becomes a man for comedic effect. But this trend continued all the way through Hollywood's history and was often met with critical and commercial success, with Bugs Bunny cartoons, 1959's Some Like It Hot, 1989's Tootsie, 1933's Mrs. Doubtfire, or the entirety of Tyler Perry's Medea film series. Yet since the plot of these films typically revolved around the tension of characters pretending to be the other gender in order to achieve some goal, like with Robin Williams spending time with his children or Dustin Hoffman wanting a job, it also subtly hinted that doing these gender switches were done so with the intent to deceive, to trick others, and which was a reinforcement of the same idea used against the transgender community, and trans women in specific, that trans folks were just transitioning in order to trick others around them, often trans women being seen as trying to trick men into having sex with them. It also framed trans people and our bodies as somehow gross and disgusting, something worthy of anger, ridicule, or disgust. Take a look at the film Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. When Jim Carrey learns that he slept with a trans woman in the film, he goes on a bender trying to cleanse himself, vomiting all over the floor. Again, seeing trans women as something disgusting or worthy of ridicule. The end victory of the film is him getting his, quote, revenge on this woman, essentially sexually assaulting her and revealing her genitals to a crowd of people, all who revel in disgust. And this is played as a victorious moment, despite it revolving around the demeaning and assault of a trans woman. This went even further, where unlike their comedic counterparts, those who actually believed in their transgender identity were also highlighted as being mentally ill or mad. Take Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, Norman Bates in Psycho, or even the Patricia personality as part of the Horde in the recent Split and Glass films. So throughout film history, while trans women were not directly or explicitly portrayed, cinematic portrayals of breaking and crossing gender norms were reinforced as deviant, duplicitous, and often only truly believed by the mentally ill, those with ill intent, or those who are trying to do crimes. The only time trans people got to see ourselves portrayed positively was in proxy representations, or characters who we could attempt to do the mental math of putting ourselves into, instead of actually having explicit representations. Like with me with the character of Jadzia Dax in Star Trek Deep Space Nine being a prime example. An alien character within the world of Star Trek who could pass memories between bodies after death, including previous hosts who were men. It should also be mentioned that gender bending was often intertwined with racial issues, such as with gender bending often mixing with blackface in cinema's early years. But while the intertwining of gender and racial representations is a fascinating subject, it falls a bit outside the time we have to discuss today. Yet I wanted to at least mention it as the discussions have interesting similarities and divergences in history and in how they actually are portrayed on screen that can be illuminating to this discussion. While many of these historical examples of trans and gender issues being portrayed in cinema still exist, I want to focus attention on how the cisgender gaze itself manifests today in a more positive light. Currently, as trans representation has increased in cultural consciousness, so too has it increased and become more complex and explicit and even more sympathetic within our modern media. Yet it's still often filtered through this idea of a cisgender gaze, through this idea that trans people are fantastical, otherworldly, or different. This lens has led to the development of two different types of trans narratives on screen: the transition narratives and the oppression narrative. Transition narratives focus on, funnily enough, the transition of a trans person from their assigned birth gender to the gender that they feel that they are and wish to present as in the world. Let's take the 2015 film The Danish Girl as an example. The Danish Girl follows the story of real-life trans woman Lily Elby, a Danish painter living in the early 1900s, and one of the first known recipients of what would be known today as gender-affirming surgeries like vaginoplasty. The transition narrative in cinema focuses on how transgender lives begin to deviate from what we see as a cisgender life. At the beginning of these stories, we see a trans person living their, quote, normal life as their gender assigned at birth. This is the Act 1 status quo, where we see a life that is presumed to be familiar to the majority cisgender audience that they will relate to as they watch the film. But as the story continues along, we, the audience, follow the trans person along as they begin to move further away from a, quote, normal cis experience to that of another gender. Thus, the film's second act is mostly defined by these terms, a struggle to move from one life to another. In this period, a trans person is most othered, most seen as fantastic, as they struggle to dress in new gendered clothing, date people outside of the straight norm, or even get surgical intervention. But then, by the third and final act of the film, we return to a binary gendered status quo that the audience recognizes. In the case of the Danish girl, a trans person living as a binary identified woman. A new but recognizable status quo. We understand what it's like to live as a man, we understand what it's like to live as a woman. So we go from man to woman, with the thing in between, the transition, being this fantastical thing. We get to see the transition from one to the other, but ultimately find the comfort in the audience in the beginning and ending in a life that feels recognizable. And this often excludes non-binary or those who don't present in a very binary representation for trans people. Also, by fitting into the normal Hollywood 3-act structure of Act 1 status quo, Act 2 upheaval of status quo, and Act 3 return to a new but happy status quo, this frames the binary gender experiences that we see the trans person portray in Act 1 and Act 3 as normal and the status quo, reinforcing a cis-normative framework where a more non-binary and subversive gender experience is considered abnormal, as we see in Act 2. This has the side effect of framing non-binary identities as abnormal or weird. And other examples of this transition narrative are Transparent, Boys Don't Cry, or the original The L Word. Also, by the way, if you want to know for sure that you're probably watching a transgender transition narrative, is when you see a trans person spend a long time looking at themselves in the mirror in the film. Remember that moment earlier where I spoke about Shia LaBeouf offering the audience a mirror of what their reaction was at seeing Megan Fox in Transformers? His anguish at seeing the beauty of her body, how we were supposed to react to her body being mirrored in Shia LaBeouf's reaction? Well, a trans person looking at themselves in a mirror is doing the same exact thing, showing the audience, through the trans character themselves, how they should find a trans person's body strange, different, or something to stare at or be fascinated at. It places trans people in an interesting viewpoint, both the protagonist and that's supposed to be the audience identifying character, and yet also, simultaneously, the object of fascination itself. Thus, the trans protagonist, when looking at a mirror in a film, becomes both gazer and object of the gaze within the piece. The oppression narrative does something different, focusing less on the small personal differences between a trans and cisgender experience and identity, but more on the societal differences in how transgender people are subjected to transphobia, homophobia, and/or misogyny. Take 2017's foreign Best Picture Oscar winner, A Fantastic Woman, where the lead character is subjected to a 2-hour-long gamut of hatred and bigotry as a trans woman. These narratives are meant to embody pity, showing how a trans person's life as a whole is distinct from a cisgender person's, who does not have to handle these struggles. There is an implicit assumption underscored by the perspective taken within these films, one that piques a cisgender curiosity by centering a plot around providing an insight into an unknown existence, or an existence so fundamentally different from that of a cisgender person. Within this framework, cisgender people are assumed to find entertainment while watching a trans person struggle against daily oppression that cisgender people typically would not face on a regular basis. And we see this type of narrative in things like Orange is the New Black or Dallas Buyers Club. Now, both the transition and oppression narratives are not solely exclusive. We see elements of the oppression narrative in works like Boys Don't Cry, for example, despite that focusing on a transition. Or we see Laverne Cox's character in transition in an episode of Orange is the New Black, despite that mainly being about an oppression narrative for her character. These two narratives intermingle, but the main goal of both is that they use a cisgender gaze to portray transgender characters as sympathetic, yet different. It forces trans people to only be seen through the lens of their transness. For all the narratives that I've told you, even the ones dating back to the beginning of film history, trans characters and even trans themes have always been mainly defined by their trans identities. Films like The Danish Girl or A Fantastic Woman are sold simply as the transgender movies. Sure, I guess the trans woman in A Fantastic Woman was a waitress, or Eddie Redmayne in The Danish Girl was a painter, but are those the things that you really think about when you think about those movies or those characters? No, the first thing you think about is that they're trans. It frames transgender people as a spectacle, something to be put on a pedestal. It's even in the name of these films. I mean, you can't get more otherworldly than A Fantastic Woman. But what makes her fantastic, though, if you watch the film, is just her dealing with the crap that trans people have to deal with every single day. There's nothing special or unique to her life within a trans experience, but it is fantastic and different compared to a cisgender one. So the point that we are left with is that she's fantastic because she's trans. And simply that. This idea otherizes and glamorizes transness, and it should be said a specific type of transness, one that focuses more on binary genders like man and woman, and typically those with white skin, though not always, and those who fit into typical beauty norms as trans or non-binary people. And by the way, I don't think that these things are inherently bad. In fact, in many ways, they can do a ton of good work. Things like The Danish Girl or Girls Don't Cry or A Fantastic Woman do help frame transgender people and transgender lives as something worth viewing positively, not negatively, and lives worth caring about. But the problem becomes several-fold. First, most of the people who directly financially benefit and critically benefit from these successful works are cisgender people. Hollywood tends to continually pat itself on the back for showcasing transgender narratives without actually including transgender people within the actual work behind the scenes of the film. Transgender portrayals in The Crying Game, The Danish Girl, Boys Don't Cry, Dallas Buyers Club, Transparent, and many others have all resulted in award nomination and wins for cisgender actors and creators. Yet with rare exception, these award-winning projects do not actually include transgender involvement, whether on-screen, creatively, education, or financially behind the scenes. In essence, cisgender actors and other creatives further their own careers on the back of transgender disenfranchisement. Their awards and accolades reinforce a cisgender-only economy, and they ignore the fact that transgender people are rarely given a chance to contribute to our own stories or represent our own narratives. It also reinforces that trans people are not really their gender, but simply are just men in dresses or girls in pants. However, things today are starting to change in the past few years, mostly based around the fact that there have been more transgender creators and creatives coming into Hollywood, as well as more understanding and sympathetic LGBTQ creators. Gay creator Greg Berlanti's superhero Arrowverse shows on the CW have featured numerous LGBTQ characters, and even feature a trans woman superhero character on Supergirl named Dreamer, who is more defined as a superhero and journalist than as a trans woman. Sense8, which was created by two transgender women, features Nomi, a woman who's better defined as a hacker than as a trans person. Pose, which was created by LGBTQ men and helped produced by trans woman Janet Mock and features numerous trans women of color both behind and in front of the screen, showcases the diversity of people and opinions even within the transgender community itself. Certainly, all these characters have elements of their trans identity that come into play at some point in their storylines when it feels important or natural, but they are not first and solely defined by their transness, which is a huge improvement over past transgender narratives. This isn't to say that non-LGBT creators can't or haven't or shouldn't have transgender people in their narratives, but it's also more likely to see a trans character who pushes beyond the typical storylines for trans people if they're helped informed by a trans person either in front of, behind of the camera. So right now, we have certainly come very far, but we still have a long way to go. Finally, I would also recommend, if you're looking for even more information on this topic that is quickly and easily accessible, please check out the documentary Disclosure on Netflix, or the YouTube video Tracing the Roots of Pop Culture Transphobia by Lindsay Ellis, or my own video on my channel Jessie Gender called A Cisgender Gaze. But beyond that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Patreon, the final frontier. These are the names of the patrons who help me explore strange new videos, seek out new topics, and boldly go where no YouTuber has gone before. Morgan, the Pirate Queen, Joe Herman Holt, Miranda Janelle, Eli Bergmas, Liz Lee Roberts, Kathleen LeBeth, Ashley Allen, Bo Kikio, D. Cassawary, Stephen Kleinard, Jem Shin, Alex Miller, Ish the Mad, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Man Chooses, A Slave Obeys, Base, Mary Mello, April Struck, Joseph Dewey, Felicia Toast, Bush, James Krivda, Barbara Ruski, Dominic Noble, Ulia Kaigut, Stephen Schuhart, Buttoneer, Mina Carroll, Jessica Wright, Peter Landers, Jared Johnson, Bar Rangato, John Steele, Barbara Heelchuk, Celestial Dawn, Geek Filter, John Weatherby, Janie Packard, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Melinda Walters, Eva Kaniva, Sky Dodo, Ulysses the Pagan, W. Randy Edie, Meadow Whisper, Beatrix Purvis, Alex Owen, Lysa, Keith Briggs, Tiffany Danger, Jedi, Indiana Jones, Gretchen Badger, Flynn, Odd, Just Odd, Lamia, Amelia Loomis, Maggie the Goblin, Kaylis, William Stewart, Chloe Dollar, Sarah Byston, Jessica Chapman, Noble Monster Comics, Andrew Lamoureux, Mary Mack, Nathan Steele, Jacob Tovar, Laura Demeraux, Euresis, Jason Knott, The Author 13, Sean Piper, Sky Skinner, Polly Mina, Troy Stahl, Lily, Maeve Munir Online, Strawberry Pup Tart, Andrew K, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Mountain Harpy, Shrib Machine Berlin, Amanda Roni Adania, Angie Push, Alan Badapple, Zone 1 Librarian, Michael Godey, Jenny Marble, Pasty, Michael Hardy Ver, Philip Hawkins, Andrew H, Mark Brown, There's My Shoulder, Corey and Bale Honkanen. I love you all. Thank you all so much for being wonderful and supporting me doing this. I cannot thank you enough.